One of the things that I like to point out as a pharmacist, and I tell my patients as well, which is it's important, is your vitamin C, your vitamin D, your zinc, washing your hands. It is so important to wash your hands. And when I did my residency to get my pharmacy license and I worked in the hospitals, one of the major things that they talked about is washing your hands for 20 seconds. Soap and water, wash your hands as often as possible. Exercise is very important. Your sunlight out there at least 15 minutes. Your best vitamin D that you're going to produce is from sunlight. You have to be out there at least 15 minutes. And your body can produce, from what I understand in some studies I saw, 10,000 units per hour. You just sitting out there in the sun, which is a lot of vitamin D, but then your body knows and regulates what you need, you know? But if you're not out there, then you take it orally, your vitamin C, your vitamin D, very important for you and your health to be able to fight off infections.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to PMA News. My name is Wayne Crouch, and tonight, along with the lovely Lisa Rose Johnston, I speak with Dr. Daniel Santiago, an American pharmacist who, after years of recommending and administering the flu shot to himself, his patients, and his family, has decided he will never again give or receive another shot. And the reason behind that? Well, tonight he's here to tell us all about it. Good evening, Dr. Santiago, and welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you doing today? I'm here to talk about the flu vaccine and some of these principles that you will be hearing tonight from us in this discussion. You hopefully will be able to apply to other things as well. And I think it's going to be a very important discussion. I think that a lot of things in this particular part of medicine are not really discussed. And we take things as granted, as fact, and nothing in science is absolute. Even in the real world, nothing's absolute. The sun doesn't come up at the same time every day and go down at the same time every day. So I'm going to share my screen. And like I said, we're going to be talking about the flu vaccine. And I have a small disclaimer. The information provided during this conversation is for general information purposes only and should not be considered as medical advice. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional for medical concerns or conditions. Do not disregard professional medical advice or delay seeking it based on this information. Your health and well-being are very important, and only a healthcare professional can provide proper diagnosis and treatment. So during this discussion, we're going to cover some topics here. The main ones we're going to have is just an introduction, how a vaccine works, homeostasis, the principle of homeostasis, which is very, very important. The protection, is vaccines protective? Are they effective? And safety signals, and then adjuvants. Right after the adjuvants, we'll probably have a brief discussion on pathogenic priming to give you an idea or at least an introduction as to what can happen in the body. Now, a vaccine is a biological preparation that provides active acquired immunity to a particular infectious or malignant disease, be it viral or bacterial. Typically contains an agent that resembles a disease-causing microorganism and is often made from weakened or killed forms of the microbe, toxins, or one of its surface proteins. It can be killed. They typically, or in the past, have used formaldehyde, and keep that in mind, the chemical name formaldehyde. It can be weakened. They have several procedures or protocols in which to use through various means to decrease the severity of infection, ability of any type of virus or bacteria. The vaccine in itself, or vaccines in theory, are supposed to train the immune system to recognize the antigen, the pathogen, which is a bacteria or virus. And I've talked in other podcasts about the use of mRNA or DNA to manufacture portions of a virus or bacteria to trigger the immune system. Really, that's gene therapy, and I'm not a proponent of that for vaccines, to be quite frank with you. It's gene therapy. It should not be in the vaccine realm at all. It has a place in medicine, but not in vaccines. It should be in the place where if you have a protein that's missing in your body, your body's not producing a protein, then at that point in time, like insulin, for example, they've been doing a lot of research in that area. That should continue. And if you're able to replace the insulin in an individual through gene therapy, I can see that as being appropriate, but we're not at that stage yet. And if we're not at that stage at that particular area of medicine, guess what? We're not ready for it in vaccines either. Another way to look at the vaccines, an agent that stimulates the body's immune system to recognize the agent as a threat, destroy it, and recognize further and destroy any of the microorganisms associated with that agent that it may encounter in the future. Now, I mentioned homeostasis in the last slide, and I would like people to understand that when it comes to homeostasis, the body's made of billions of cells, all dependent on the complex biochemical reactions, all dependent on the environment that is finely tuned. And when you have something from external being introduced internal, you change that. And in the body, you have a constant energy production, you have constant nutrient movement, constant removal of waste products and cells that die, but it's all at the right time, at the right place. Everything's pretty much synchronized. When it's out of whack, you get into some disease state processes. And you have to know and have to understand that we're an open system. That is, we're symbiotic and in balance with nature. So we gain things from the outside in, but it goes through a process. So when we start bypassing those processes, that's where we can run into some trouble if not done properly. And I like to introduce or keep you in mind of homeopathy. I know in the days of past, homeopathy was a big thing. And honestly, when my daughter was born, I used homeopathic products. There's a lot of homeopathic products that I will tell you are not effective. However, there's some principles there that perhaps in the days of old, people saw, and they weren't scientific minds, but they saw that it worked. They saw that there was something there. So when it comes to this homeopathic medicine, I like to draw a parallel because usually people don't understand the full principles of homeopathy. And I know that it's in its theory of the disease, that's centered around principles that Hahnemann termed miasms. And miasms is where the homeopathic, people have had a tough time because it's inconsistent with the subsequent identification of viruses and bacteria as causes of disease. But there's certain principles in that really relate to vaccines, like cures like. That's one of the first principles. So if you have an antigen and you're in the vaccines, you're trying to present a antigen to the body so that the body produces an immune system. And that's one of my first contentions, my first discussions that I would like to point out, hey, perhaps we need to revisit this. Are we actually presenting the right antigen in its form to the immune system to be able to build an immune reaction that it can remember? The second thing is dilution. And dilution is just the addition of water and alcohol. And that becomes very hard to defend for a lot of homeopathic people that believe in homeopathy. For example, when you're dealing with 30C, which is a typical dilution, what does that mean? What does that mean? 1 drop in 100 or 30 times over or 1 in 10 to the 60th power. That's 1 part per million, per million, per million, per million, per million, and so on. So if you put that in perspective, it's like if you take the Earth in itself and it's a distance to the sun. So how does that work? You see what I'm saying? So that we can come back to because you're dealing with a quantum effect there. So I'm not saying that, they were wrong, but in its application, perhaps they were misguided. And then the last principle is percussion, which is basically the shaking, memory of the water. Now, we're not going to go into every single one of these principles because it's just the first one we're going to be talking about in this discussion or trying to get across so you can get an understanding of it. But for percussion, for water memory, I would like you to refer to Luc Montagnier's documentary in 2014 on water memory. It is a quantum event. So even though the homeopaths have a tough time really understanding the percussion in terms of the quantum type thing, there is something there. So that's something to let you know. And just to give you one more thing about the like versus, like cures like. When you take, for example, this paper clip is an antigen, right? When we process this, and this is what I want you to remember throughout the next slides in this discussion, when you process this paperclip as an antigen, right, and you run it through chemicals like, say, formaldehyde or some other chemicals which affect its proteins and amino acids, right? This is still a paperclip. Is the body seeing this as equivalent to this paperclip in its function? That's a question that to be asked, you know? So when you think about protection and you look at these flu vaccines and so forth, you have to ask yourself, is it actually protecting? So over the years, I've looked at the flu vaccine vary in terms of its efficacy. So instead of you listening to me say, hey, it doesn't work, hey, there's a problem here, hey, it's only effective between this range, I'd rather present to you the authorities. So the Mayo Clinic is one of those authorities, and it's internationally medical center known. And what do they say based on what they see? And they see that reviews of the flu season data since 2009 find that the vaccine protection ranges from a low of 22% to a high of 56%. Now, the way they explain it is looking at the US population, that means millions of fewer illnesses and visits to the healthcare professional. Flu vaccine also lowers the number of people with an illness who needs hospital care or who die of influenza. And here I refer to you to Aaron Siri and his work so far. I like to have a discussion on safety and how the CDC and how our government agencies are doing this. Why do I say that? Well, I'm going to end this here, not end this slide here, because I want to show you something from Sabine. And Dr. Sabine is from Germany, and she unearthed some of the through FOIA, some of the communiques about the influenza vaccine. And one of the questions that was asked is there any reliable influenza data anywhere? And guess what? Unearthed through the ICANN, FOIA, in terms of there's something wrong with how they collect data. They collect data, but they don't release the data. So there's something going on here that we need to really dig in and see. And as I continue with this discussion, you're going to see maybe there's something wrong here, and we need to really get people to understand, hey, what's going on here. For example, one of the examples from the FOIA that Sabine puts in her Substack is, and this is directly from the government officials, can you explain why the estimates on this page are different from previously published and reported estimates for the 2017 and 2018? For example, total flu-related deaths during 2017 2018 was previously estimated to be 79, but the current estimate is 61,000. So if you look at her website and you look at her Substack, you can read through it and know. But this is something to think about, because when you have figures like this being published by major medical centers, where you have a range of 22% to a high of 56%, that seems kind of low, In addition to that, you have to think to yourself, how effective is the flu vaccine in the spread and preventing the spread? Well, I went back into the literature, and this I always had known for a while, but this is something that is seen in the literature and people know about it. And for some reason in the past, it used to be in the patient inserts, what's given to you from the manufacturer that's contained within the medicine, so this used to be in there. And this is here's a study that shows this study of 700 people who tested positive for influenza found the flu vaccine to be 21%, and that was estimated effective against spreading the flu to household members. I find that number kind of low.
It's incredible.
And I present the paper, and the reason why I do is because sometimes, well, most of the time, I get people I see people stating something, they automatically go, that's not true. Show me the information. Well, I'm showing you the information. Here's the study. And if you look at their findings, you'll see it exactly here. The estimated effectiveness of influenza vaccines for preventing secondary infections among household contacts was 21%. Wow. But then when you read, meaning influenza vaccination was associated with a reduced risk of laboratory confirmed influenza virus infection among household contacts. To me, that's a twisting of words.
Yeah, you just about have as much luck avoiding the flu or stopping it from spreading to your family members by just locking yourself in your bedroom, or sequestering yourself away from somebody in the house.
Laboratory confirmed. That means it just wasn't confirmed in a laboratory. Doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right. Right. And you'll see that in the next in the future in this discussion, I'm going to be talking about mercury, you know, and I don't want to get into that at the moment, but I'd like to introduce that little concept real quick of the mercury we'll be going into. I just don't like the way it's presented to people, to me, no form of mercury is safe. It's just that simple. And just like the oil analogy that we were discussing prior to starting this presentation, this discussion, when you're dealing with surfactants, for example, surfactants have the ability, depending on its molecular properties and environmental conditions, to spread over large areas, and they say, for example, think about your Tide. Your Tide does a very effective work in terms of removing the dirt within your clothes, but those clothes have a lot of surface area. I know people look at the surface area of a shirt on the outside, but you have to look at the inside of that shirt, so it's double that surface area that that you're looking at. So when you're dealing with the oils, like one drop of oil can cover about a 2-car garage, the surface of a 2-car garage. A cup of water, can basically fog up the San Francisco Bay. So, you think about science, you got to think about those analogies like that. It's very difficult for people to understand those type of things. What are the equivalents there? So what other, is this effective? You have to ask yourself, So I went to the MMR from the CDC. This is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report for October the 3rd, 2024. For the 2024 flu season, the flu vaccine was estimated to be 34.5% effective against hospitalization overall. Now, within some special sections of the population, a little bit higher, 57.7%, according to them reporting it, 39% in young children, and adults overall, 31.2%. So I just find that 2/3, almost half, very difficult for me to really grasp, those numbers to be the way it's presented in our media as being 100%. And we saw that in COVID, where it's 100% effective, 95% effective, 90% effective, 89% effective. Those numbers kept on going down and down and down, and it's amazing to me that people say, okay, instead of saying, no, enough.
Extreme gamble looking at those numbers. That's just very, wow.
Yes. So when you get into the patient insert, right? I don't know if you can see this. I was going to present this in a couple more slides down, but I like to show something here. If you can see here where it says full prescribing information, where do it says 14 here. If you go to 14 here, right? Right? You see the 14 here? So go down to 14. You see the clinical studies.
Yep.
I look for, in the clinical studies, they used to show, efficacy, I no longer see that, as you can see here, and that's why I'm showing it. Maybe I'm missing it. That's why I'm showing it too. Where does it say anything about efficacy here?
Now, why is that Well, why would that not be there, Dr. Santiago?
It's hard to say. It could be maybe the lawyers saying, "Hey, don't tell people it's not efficacy. Don't put the efficacy in there because if it's low, they get the flu. Something happens, then they'll sue you. You know, it could be a defensive type thing in the law. In the law, I don't know, but they just report, "Hey, you got an antigen, but you got an antibody response, but is that antibody response actually to the flu?" You know, we know we have a response, but in the coming slides, we'll see what I'm talking about. And you'll also see that in these other ones here. So I have some other patient inserts as well. But before I go to that, I want to come back to the talk. Go back here. And I like people to understand something that is important. And in Australia, you had a PRR through FOIA through Senator Rennet, I believe who it was, you know, and he was very helpful during my first presentation concerning the COVID vaccination. And what's important about the PRR, this is something that in pharmacy school we learned. And I know that a lot of doctors get this too in pharmacology, you know. And what the PRR is the proportional reporting ratio. And this is what they use as a safety signal. All right, so it's just not the VAER. They use the VAERS as its basis, but what the PR measures is the relationship between product and adverse event based on a relative increase of the proportion of individual cases related to an adverse event. So basically, it's a statistical measure that compares the frequency, number of times, of a specific adverse event reported after receiving a flu shot or another vaccine relative to the frequency of that same adverse event reported for other vaccines. All right. And you'll see in the coming slides, when it comes to the flu shot, what the PRR is, okay? And I'm not going to bore you with the mathematics, but it's just calculated by dividing the portion of the specific adverse events following a flu shot by that of the same adverse events of other vaccines in a comparison group. But the important thing to remember is that the PRR greater than 1, it suggests that an adverse event is reported more frequency for a drug of interest compared to other drugs, potentially indicating a safety signal. So in other words, if the PRR is greater than 1, that's a red flag. There might be something wrong. And I know that in some studies, they'll double the PRR to 2 to make sure that it is a safety signal, that it's not being interfered by other things, you know? So here's a study on the PRR, and forgive me, because I'm trying to see the top here. I can't see the top very well. Oops. Previous. So here is a study that was done for 2005 to 2019. And the different safety signals in influenza vaccine in adults and the elderly, a nationwide post-marketing surveillance study from 2005 to 2019. What's important here? Well, they did find some serious adverse events. They found the safety stickers were there, and they found that the elderly were more susceptible, you know? So when you look at the third column here on this lower right corner, you'll see that the PRR is here. They use some other factors as well to study this, but for our discussion purposes and for time, given the time that we have, we're just talking about the PRR for right now. But if you look at some of the PRRs for, say, neuritis, pharyngitis, asthenia, death, fatigue, you know, you'll see that it's very high. They're greater than 1, you know? So that's giving you a flag. If you're going to say injection site at pressure, you know, tenderness at the injection site, you're coming at somebody with a sharp object and you're inserting it in their body. So you're going to definitely have, you know, a high PRR there because everyone's going to hurt, you know, it's a sharp object, you know?
Yeah.
But when you start with dysphonia, which is an 8, you know, okay, now you have something there. When you're dealing with fatigue and it's a 7, you're like, okay, wait a minute, what's going on there? But in this study, yeah. Now in the COVID vaccines with the FOIA that Senator Rennet was able to get, you're looking at cardiac PRRs of about 30. That's super high. And we already know about the cardiac issues and the clotting that is occurring in patients who've taken the COVID vaccine. But one of the things here that's important to see is that this study showed that you have serious adverse events, that the elderly were more susceptible than the young. And that accounted for, in the elderly, for almost 12%, and in versus the young, which 2.85%, respectively. So that's something to think about, you know? That's something to think about. And here's another one, and forgive me, because I just want to make sure that people know that I'm not cherry picking and I'm putting things aside, you know, because I want people to understand that here's the data, here are the goods. So I'm just not saying it, you know, and if you want to go back and look at these studies, go right ahead, because there are places like JAMA, they're in places like Nature. So they're mainstream media type journals, not, you know, National Enquirer, which is like a tabloid type thing in your supermarket, you know? So this next one here is the post-marketing surveillance study on influenza vaccine in South Korea, using a nationwide spontaneous reporting database with multiple data mining. And they used other methods as well, but one, like I said, we're focusing in on is this the PRR. And this one particular, they identified 36 safety signals for the influenza vaccine. And they also found that 7 safety signals were unlabeled, you know? So in other words, they didn't expect it, you know? And I gave you a couple here where the highest ones, like narcolepsy, something to think about, you know? Fatigue is the one that I usually see when people get the flu vaccine type thing, and I hear that a lot in the pharmacy. Muscle weakness is another one, which I hear from patients in the pharmacy. Rash is another one. But it seems like most people don't relate it to what they got. In other words, what they received, you know? So
Hypertension.
that's something.
Does that mean people with blood pressure?
It means lower blood pressure is what that means. Your blood pressure is lowered. And that could be just because of an immune type reaction, any number of things. Those mechanisms have not been fully elucidated. They just know that it happens. So that is part of in the patient insert, that is listed as a possible side effect. So absolutely there, you know? Go here. And I like to get into a little bit on the vaccine adjuvants, but there were a couple of things I wanted to get out of the way in terms of definition, you know? And in respect, I like to show you or give you some definitions on one or two things. One of them being, come here, if you look at, see, the fluad quadvalent, and that quadvalent means it's 4 strains, right? And we'll get into that in next couple of slides. But what I want you to see is this is an emulsion, right? When you're dealing with, see if I can find it here. When you're dealing with the seeds of regular fluad, that's an emulsion. When you're dealing with, say, a fluria, that's a suspension. So you're dealing with terms here that we need to be acquainted just a little bit. There's more than just this, but just for the basics, you know? An emulsion is a mixture of 2 or more liquids that are normally immiscible, you know? Like say, for example, mayonnaise, butter, you know, that's an emulsion. Oil and water, water and oil, you know? Homogenized milk, you know? Where the milk fat is in water. The milk proteins act as the emulsifier. You know, so things in your everyday life, your salad dressing, you know, vinegar and balsamic vinegar and oil, for example, you know, that's a type of emulsion, you know, and then your suspension is just basically you're a particle within solution. Let's look at it that way, you know. So I want people to understand, I want you to understand that, but also I want you to understand that in the description of these. So when you look at your insert and you go down to description and say, here's number 11. I don't know if you can see my hand or the cursor going around description. And you come down to 11, because we want to get into the adjuvants here. And I'm hoping I'm able to get the points across that I need to.
Sorry, Doc, can you just briefly describe to people who, I mean, I know most people would understand, but some people might not, what an adjuvant actually is?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about, I will give you a definition of that in the next slide. Absolutely. Give me 1 second. I just wanted to show you something here. And if you look at here, this is the description of what's inside the shot that people receive. And if you look at it, one of the things that is in there is mercury. Now, usually in the single dose type syringes, they say that there's no mercury in those syringes, but in a multi-dose vial and in other formulations, there is mercury. Okay, so that's, you know, that's considered a preservative, you know, but they sometimes will use aluminum and they'll use an adjuvant to spur an immune reaction. In other words, potentiate how the immune system sees the antigen now. But what I like you to understand and see and grasp is that there's more than just one type of ingredient within these vials, like potassium chloride, you know, the sucrose, neomycin, which is an antibiotic. You know, it's in here, you know. Give me 1 second here, go back here. And I'm sorry, I'm going in and out. I just want people to understand that, again, when I say adjuvant and when I'm mentioning these products, that these products are in these shots. So, vaccine adjuvants. Vaccine adjuvants, these adjuvants are vaccine components that enhance the magnitude, breadth, and durability of the immune response. The exact mechanism is still being elucidated, okay? Now, some of these ingredients, which I showed you in the last example in the patient insert, the flu shot can contain a variety of ingredients, such as the antigen, which is the inactivated influenza virus killed, influenza type virus proteins, stabilizers like gelatin, sucrose you saw in the last example, antibiotics like neomycin, which you did see in the patient insert, formaldehyde, and this is key, might be key to our discussion here, which I'll elucidate a little further in the coming slides. But formaldehyde is sometimes used to inactivate the influenza virus. So if you remember that first example that I said to you, where if you have an antigen, well, if you look at the 2024 Nobel Prize winner this year, you'll notice that it was given in chemistry. And what is important about that Nobel Prize given to the chemists in 2024 is that it was given for that geometry and structure translate to function in proteins, you know? So that's something that I've been stating for quite a while. So how does that principle, or how does that process to make a vaccine affect the antigen's geometry and structure? Because structure and geometry can equal function. So if you use formaldehyde and you put it onto a protein, and that protein, before the formaldehyde looks like this paper clip, but then after the formaldehyde, it looks like this here. It's still a paper clip, but it doesn't have the same shape and geometry. So therefore, its function has been altered. You know, I'm hoping you can follow that. But one of the main things that with formaldehyde is formaldehyde reacts with amino acids in proteins, and it leads to cross-linking. So you've changed something there. So you're presenting an antigen that's non-functional. The body's viewing it in its after state, not its prior state. So can that be the reason why you have such low efficacy, low prevention of transmission? Could that be the possibility? Because you're dealing with this normally, and that's why natural infection trumps a vaccine injection versus the after treatment. It's really something to think about there. You don't have to be a scientist to understand that when a protein in its natural state has its normal geometry and function, it's functioning the way it's supposed to be. And then when you apply a process to it, it looks something like this, and it no longer has
on the screen. Doc, can we just stop sharing the screen for a moment so you can actually show the viewers at home?
Sure. Absolutely. See if you can see that. Is that possible to see that paper clip here?
Absolutely.
And then when you apply a process to it, it can be looking like this. Because when you use formaldehyde, you have cross-linking occurs because it reacts with the amino acids in the proteins, leading to cross-linking. So that changes the geometry and structure. It also promotes aggregation. So formaldehyde can cause proteins to aggregate, forming clumps, you know. So can those clumps be affecting how the cells are looking at that, you know? And then the last thing with that is, and this is important, well, no, there's two more. You have a denaturation, which changes the geometry and structure, which again, we've already talked about that and showed that with the paperclip analogy. So what's the relationship between the antigen prior to protocol being processed for a vaccine and after, you know? And I'm going to touch on the scientific fact or a scientific principle here, and it's still being studied. But when you're looking, the body gets rid of viruses and bacteria through processes too. So there's something in the body called ubiquitin, right? And ubiquitination, and I'm sorry, my pronunciation is horrible. I should know how to pronounce this. But it's called ubiquitin molecules to proteins that can lead to protein degradation and other cellular functions. So it's used to move things out, flag it, tag it, you know? So when you have this example, again, of this paperclip being a protein and it's changed, and then you're presenting this to the immune system after that process, say with formaldehyde, which we've just discussed, how is the body recognizing those sites? I mean, it's seeing something different, you know? To me, that could be the reason why it's showing something different. When you have this paperclip, okay, this paperclip represents an antigen, protein, for example, you know? Now, this protein, when it's processed, say influenza, right? Influenza virus vaccine they use formaldehyde to process this. But that formaldehyde has effects to the protein. And one of the major effects that it has is cross-linking. In other words, it reacts with amino acids in the proteins, leading to cross-linking. It alters protein structure and geometry. So when you're after that process, you're presenting something like this maybe to the immune system, because it's certainly, once you do the formaldehyde is no longer going to be, after cross-linking, aggregation, denaturation, and, you know, changing the way ubiquitin molecules can attach to it, it's not going to be looking at something like this for that. It's going to be looking at something like this for that. You know? So that's stuff that occurs at the molecular level that I'm trying to bring to the macro level for us to be able to see, you know? So I gave you a definition of adjuvants in the last slide, but here's another point with the adjuvants, okay? And in the paper that I showed in the first slide on adjuvants, they have aluminum, MF59, squalene, etc. And it has a table in there. You can read this on your own to understand that these adjuvants are still not fully known what their effects are. It's supposed to increase a immune reaction, but what type of immune reaction are we getting? And one of the things that I'd like to point out is the relevance of stress response signals, tissue damage, and metabolic and nutrient sensing pathways is poorly understood. So remember that principle that I talked about, homeostasis. You're introducing something that's typically not in the body. So then the body has to react to that. It's not in its processes, you know? And I know that they like to say that you find mercury in fish, etc. But through the years, industrial processing, that mercury was never supposed to be in fish and in our environment, you know? So
we put it there as well.
Yeah, we put it in there as well. So when you look at the mercury adjuvant example, which I talked about, it's not found in the human body. Should it be placed there, you know? And when they say, hey, you know, well, if we have some other type of mercury and we see that it doesn't stay in the body, then it's perfectly fine. You know, when you're dealing with a particular argument on a particular antigen, it should be that particular antigen or substance that we're talking about, not making a comparison in terms of that other substance is not found in the body. We place it in the body, it gets out, but it's not the same thing. And when it comes to this mercury, right? You know what's important about this mercury is that the proportion, it comes down to organic and inorganic, okay? And elemental. So mercury is basically in three forms. And for many years, they say, okay, well, mercury products or derivatives have been used since the 1930s safely. Well, then the question that I have is, has it been actually studied in animals to see? And they like to use to say, well, yes, exposed monkeys, we did some animal analysis and we found that uh, it's safe, you know? Well, apparently in in this in 2000 in the 2000s, you had a study done on that very thing. And what they found was that there was mercury in the brains of monkeys, but not in their bloodstream. So it was there. And I'm about to show you that, but I want to give you a little bit more background. And I'm trying to contemplate in my mind not to immerse you so much in chemistry and turn you off, because I want you to understand it. I don't want to turn off your interest in it. But inorganic mercury is mercury combined with other chemical elements such as chlorine, sulfur, or oxygen. Organic mercury is combined just with carbon. And I'm going to show you images of that in the next couple of slides. And then you just have elemental mercury. But when things get, if the body can metabolize it and break it apart, you might end up with just mercury, and mercury's no good, you know? But when you're dealing with mercury in itself, like say thimerosal, you know, and I don't know if you can see this here or not very well, but here with the thimerosal here, you'll see that with these authors here, they came to the conclusion, the results indicate that methylmercury is not a suitable reference for the risk assessment from exposure to thimerosal-derived mercury. You know, knowledge of the toxiokinetics and developmental toxicity of thimerosal is needed to afford a meaningful assessment of the developmental effects of thimerosal-containing vaccines. So again, this is the study that showed mercury in the brains of monkeys. And if you see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, a higher percentage of the total mercury in the brain was in the form of inorganic mercury for the thimerosal exposed monkeys. That's huge. That's huge. You know, you can't be telling people something's safe and you really didn't look at it. You know? And this was done in 2005. So mercury in itself, we already know that it's liquid at room temperature and pressure. It's toxic. You know, you shouldn't touch it with your hands. And I remember as a kid, we used to, I think the vacuum tubes used to have mercury in it. And you know, we used to play with our vacuum tube television sets when they went bad. Used to break those little things, and you had mercury. Go figure. I was exposing myself to mercury, but I'm glad I didn't suck on the paint chips that had lead too when I was a kid either. You know, so you know, pretty much almost everyone has a small amount of mercury in their body, but mercury's not essential to the human body, and it is toxic. Is the point? You know. And if you want to learn more about mercury, there you can go to Noor's Learning. This is where I got this table of the elemental table, and it'll give you more information on it. But here's the one I like to get people to understand here, which is this is pretty important here. And this is thimerosal, the one that you find in vaccines. This is what's called the inorganic mercury because it's combined with chemical elements such as chlorine or sulfur, you know, or oxygen, you know. This is ethyl mercury, has two carbons, and this is methyl mercury. So they're comparing this ethyl mercury to methyl mercury. How can you? They're not the same structure. They're going to have different effects because they're different structures.
They look
And to say, right, they're exactly, you can see how different it is. And even though they say we've been using it since the 1930s, well, I mean, that doesn't mean anything to me, to be quite frank with you. You know, why was it added in the 1930s? Was it because, you know, we just didn't know better and we just put it there at the beginning of this, you know? But then over the years, hey, we noticed that there's something wrong, such as when the autism rates, which we need to look at. We need to study this. We need to see why there's been 1 in 100,000 in the 80s to 1 in what, 34 today.
It's
There are other.
incredible. You talk about alarm bells and red flags and warning signals. What happened there? No, I mean, that's
Yeah,
astounding.
yeah. So when someone tells me, hey, you want a flu shot? For me personally, I'm going to say no. If 20 years ago, I would have said, yeah, okay, that's fine. But that's before uncovering and studying things that say to me, okay, there's something wrong here. There's something that needs to be checked out here. And to me, if it's not in the body, chances are I'm gonna say to you, no, I don't want it.
So we've
You know,
spoken about
so
what is there and what is actually on the inserts and what we know about, but what about contaminants? I mean, we've just found a lot of DNA contaminants in a lot of the COVID shots. Is that also an issue, do you think, with the regular vaccines, contamination?
well, when you're dealing with the HPV, that's one of the issues with the HPV in terms of DNA contamination because of the way it's processed. So they were not able to get all the DNA contamination in HPV. So there are studies to show, and I wish I had that in front of me to show you but there is, where people took the first shot of the HPV, right? It's supposed to guard you against the human papillomavirus, right? But then when they took the second shot of HPV, it reversed it and made you more susceptible to the HPV. Now, is that due to the DNA contamination, or is that due to the processing? Because as we discussed earlier, when you're processing that virus and it looks like this paper clip, and then after the process, that same virus is changed, depending on the process, your amino acids, your geometry and structures change. And that's important. That's why the Nobel Prize in 2024 went to those chemists to show that geometry and structure is important for function. It's just that simple. We can't ignore we can't ignore things just because we want to make some money. There's nothing wrong with money. It's the love of money that's bad. And we shouldn't justify certain things just to make money and just to be able to put our heads on the pillow at night. I can't. I'm sorry. I have to tell you, hey, this is what I'm seeing. And dealing with more your question again to the contaminants, vaccines are not the only things that will contain some of these ingredients in it, like mercury. You have dental fillings, like amalgam. Silver fillings contain about 40 to 50% mercury, but that use is declining. And they used to use mercury. I bet it was diluted, you know, but again, that's fallen out of favor. And I'm not knocking homeopathic medicine because there's certain products that I've used and I have recommended that I have seen good results that has not been a placebo effect. Arnica montana for me for bruises have worked out really well. And a lot of physicians out there recommend it for a lot of people, you know? So what could be happening, you know? And this is one of those things that concerns me in quite in a bit. But before I go to that, I like to show you a image of mercury and where it can be coming from. And as you can see here, like a coal plant, for example, or something type of industrial, I don't want to demean because we need coal. I don't want to demean certain industrial processes because our modern way of life is dependent on it, but we have to do it in a responsible way, you know. So coal plants, we need it for electricity, but we should have some filters there, some processes there, so that the mercury that comes out or leaches out doesn't get into our food chain. We can control, we can modify some of these things. I think it's important for us to know, you know. So I wanted to make that point there. Sorry for the soapbox, but it's one of those things that we're all in the same boat here. So I like to point out something here, and it goes back to where we talked about how this antigen is being presented uh, within the body itself. We talked about that paperclip analogy, if you remember correctly. Well, here's a study here that was done by Wolf, right? And in this is titled "Influenza Vaccination Respiratory Virus Interference Among Department of Defense Personnel During the 2017 and 2018 Influenza Virus." So what's important about this? Well, what he showed was, well, first let me tell you what vaccine interference, right? In itself, if you look at here in the abstract, the vaccine interference phenomenon goes against the basic assumption of the test negative vaccine effectiveness study that vaccination does not change the risk of infection with other respiratory illness, thus potentially biasing vaccine effectiveness results in the positive direction. So in other words, vaccine interference is when you take a vaccine and you get sick. You've heard this plenty of times when people say, hey, I had the vaccine. Is the vaccine causing me an issue? And we were told as medical professionals, just let them know it's not vaccine, you were already sick. Well, this study here is showing, okay, maybe you were vaccinated for the flu itself, influenza, but it made you more susceptible to, guess what? Coronavirus and other human metapneumoviruses as well, like RSV. So they share common symptoms to the flu. So I'm not going to discount that perhaps it was the flu that you got anyway, because it comes back to the example that I showed you, the analogy that I showed you about the paperclip. When processed, the antigen that you're presenting to the immune system is different. Your geometry and structure. And I repeat that a lot. Because that's important. And I think it's been ignored. When you change the geometry and structure of a protein, you've changed its function. It's just that simple. You're going to present it to an immune system that's been around for millions of years. If you believe in evolution, 6,000 plus years, because God created it that way for the people who are non-evolutionists. So you have a system that has been tried and true over time to prevent illness, and you're messing with it. You're juicing it up. So you don't want to. I don't have a problem with you presenting an antigen to the body. Right? I don't have that problem. But I have a problem when you're presenting something that it's not a true antigen to the body for it to know how to defend itself and then leave it vulnerable to other infections. So that's something that we need to work on, because what I just described there is what's called pathogenic priming. And those are terms that I want people to know and be acquainted with. So when you're with your doctor, with your healthcare professional, you can discuss it with them, And basically, when you're dealing with pathogenic priming, you're dealing with an invasive pathogen that resembles some counterpart configuration in the host. So in other words, a protein that the virus, antigen of some sort, is somewhat close to that of a protein found in the body. But the body knows, hey, this protein's not supposed to be there because there's something different about it. And that's what concerns me when you processing the paperclip to something else, that you're creating the environment for pathogenic priming, and then you have what autoimmune type issues. Is that part of the reason why? Does that explain or help explain why we've had an increase in autoimmune type problems since the 80s? Because we've increased the number of vaccines that are being placed out there in the market. So we have to have a real discussion about this, not a defensive, offensive discussion, but we need to come together and say, hey, there is something wrong. It's just that simple. But we can't ignore the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room are the shots that we're taking into our body that are not there initially, And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. And if you need any elucidations or more further explanations, you can always contact me at my email here or through Pure Media Australia, because Wayne and Lisa will be more than happy to give me a call or, send me an email. Hey, Doc, can you please explain this for me? I think they were a little bit over people's heads, and we want people to understand it the best way possible. But thank you for your time.